Good afternoon. My name is Eric Walker, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Orkney Aviation Festival online. The Orkney International Science Festival, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, marked the occasion with its very first hugely successful online festival. This year, we are honoured to help out and enable the Aviation Festival to be brought directly to you wherever you are. Firstly, I'm pleased to introduce Moya MacDonald, who is a founder member of Another Orkney Production, an Orkney-based heritage organisation who run 3 annual programmes: Orkney Aviation Festival, Orkney Archive Film Project Billy's Night Out, and each May celebrating Scapa Flow. Moya left Orkney many years ago to do a history degree and has been working her way north very slowly. She's only got as far as Haddington. Moya, would you like to say a few words about the Aviation Festival?
Thank you so much. I certainly would. Hello and welcome everyone to this year's Orkney Aviation Festival. Like many other organisations this year, we thought we'd end up having to cancel all our events. But thanks to our good friends at the Orkney International Science Festival, they offered us this wonderful opportunity to have a day of talks online. And we have some wonderful events to share with you. I hope you'll be able to tune in today at 3:30 for a session celebrating the 55th anniversary of the Britten-Norman Islander. And we're very pleased to say, as a special guest, we have the Managing Director, William Hynett of Britten-Norman. And again, at 7 p.m, we've got Dr. Nina Baker giving a wonderful talk about women engineers in aeronautical science. I'd now like to hand back after saying we're so delighted. Our opening talk now is with Commander David Hobbs, an old friend of the Aviation Festival. And he's come and given some wonderful talks over the years for us. And I'm particularly looking forward to the one he's about to give now on Squadron Commander Dunning. Back to you.
Okay, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker to you, Commander David Hobbs, MBE, RN, retired, who is an acclaimed author and naval historian. David served in the Royal Navy from 1964 until 1997 as a Fleet Air Arm pilot flying fixed-wing and rotary aircraft. He then became curator and principal historian of the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton in Somerset, before becoming a full-time author and lecturer in 2006. He's written many books on naval aviation, including the Royal Navy's air service in the Great War, which includes the story of Squadron Commander Dunning, and the dawn of carrier strike and the world of Lieutenant Lucy DSORN, which includes the story of the attack on the Königsberg. David lectures and broadcasts on naval subjects worldwide and has been a regular speaker at events in Orkney. Last year, David took part in events in Orkney to commemorate the 80th anniversary of RNAS Hatston, HMS Sparrowhawk, including unveiling an information board at Kirkwall Auction Mart and leading a number of guided tours of this former important World War II aerodrome, the first operational one with hard surface landing. This afternoon, David Hobbs is going to tell us about Squadron Commander Dunning, the man and the plane. If you have any questions or comments for David, please enter them in YouTube's live chat. They'll be then passed through to here by some ingenious process, and we can discuss them after David's talk. Enough from me. Here is your speaker for today, Commander David Hobbs.
Thank you for those kind words. By 1917, aircraft had become an important part of naval operations, but seaplanes, which take off and land on the water, had proved impossible to operate in most sea conditions. From 1915, the Royal Navy had been able to launch high-performance wheeled aircraft, such as fighters, from platforms on warships, but some way had to be found to land them on a moving ship. Squadron Commander Dunning showed the way. First slide, please. This is him, Squadron Commander Edwin Harris Dunning, Royal Naval Air Service. He was born in 1892. He joined the Navy as a career officer at the age of 13 and went to the naval colleges at Osborne and Dartmouth. He passed out in 1910 as a midshipman, was appointed to the battleship Hibernia and then to the battleship Russell. But before he could take up that appointment, he came down with what was diagnosed at first as bronchitis. Sent to a naval hospital, it was treated. They subsequently decided it was tuberculosis. In 1911, his father asked if he could take him away and put him in a private clinic that could cure it. But in 1912, he was reboarded, and the Navy found that he was still suffering from tuberculosis, and he was medically discharged. In 1914, however, on the outbreak of the First World War, he came forward and volunteered for duty with the Royal Naval Air Service. As you can imagine, they put him through a medical board and he was found to be fit. So he joined the Royal Naval Air Service and was instantly given the rank of Flight Lieutenant because of his previous naval experience and training. He joined the Navy's first air station at Eastchurch on the 4th of October, 1914, and he qualified as a pilot on the 24th of October, only 20 days later. He got the Royal Aero Club's certificate as a pilot, number 949. Next slide, please. This is Eastchurch, where he was trained. As I say, it was the first naval air station in the world. It shared the field on the Isle of Sheppey with several other organisations, including the Royal Aero Club. And you can see the words Aero Club Ground in the bottom right-hand corner. And to give you an idea of how small aviation was in 1914, the line of buildings in the middle were the Royal Aero Club's hangars and grounds. The building at the top in the middle was what was called the Navy Shed, in which it kept all its aeroplanes in 1912. Top left, there's a building called the Navy Bungalow, which doubled as an office, wardroom, and everything else you could think of. And the buildings on the left were the Short Brothers factory, where they built aircraft. Next slide, please. Aeroplanes before 1914, when Dunning started flying, were individuals. Each one was different, each one had its own character, and they tended to get names. One of them I rather liked was called the Field Kitchen, because the engine was so hot that it cooked the pilot, so they didn't stay airborne in it for very long. This is one of Short Brothers' designs. It's the S-39, and it was called the Triple Twin. It had two engines, one at the back, you can see just behind the pilot, which pushed the aircraft forward, and another one in front of the pilot, which drove two propellers through belt drives. Two engines, three propellers, triple twin. You can see it's got two sailors holding it back. Like all aeroplanes until the late 1920s, it had no brakes. Next slide, please. This is a particularly famous naval aircraft, and it's one that Dunning would have done his training on in 1914. It's Short Brothers S-38, seen at Eastchurch outside the Short Brothers factory. It was the first naval aeroplane in the world to take off from a moving warship in 1912, flown by Commander C.R. Sampson. It was only the second aeroplane of any description flown by anybody in the world to take off from a warship. It was the first naval aeroplane in the world to fly at night, the first naval aeroplane in the world to land on the water, and the first naval aeroplane in the world to be maintained by sailors, air mechanics, rather than mechanics from the firm that built it, Short Brothers. You can just about make out the pilot's wicker work seat with its large belt strapped to the bottom wing in the middle. The drum to the left of it is the fuel tank. The engine's a pusher at the back. It's a 50 horsepower Lerone rotary engine. And a rotary engine means that it had a fixed crankcase and all 9 cylinders and the propeller rotated around it, an arrangement that saved weight. The pilot's controls with a big stick you can see in front of the wickerwork seat, and of rudder pedals. By moving those, you moved wires that deflected the surfaces, which you can see hanging down at the moment, and controlled the aircraft in flight. Next slide, please. And this is what a pilot looked like strapped into an early aeroplane. I think for good reason, one of the early commentators said that he thought they looked like animated bird cages. That's quite a good way of describing them. You can see here the tiny seat. You can't quite make out the belt and its buckle holding him in. This is aviation cadet Wriggle, a contemporary of Dunning's in 1914. You can see his right hand clutching the control column, moving it backwards and forwards, move the elevator and put him nose up, nose down. Moving it left, right, moved a different set of wires and banked the wings to turn. His feet are on the rudder bar. There was no throttle control. The engine was either on, giving full revolutions, or off. To turn it off, the switch you can see he's got his finger on with his left hand, controlled the magneto. You obviously had the engine full on to take off and climb, but to dive and then land, you switched the engine off. If you were maneuvering and you didn't want to accelerate, you turned the engine on and off, what's called blipping it. And as long as the propeller continued to rotate in the airflow, that was all right. It would probably restart. If the propeller stopped, that was it. The only way you could start the engine was by having a mechanic swing the propeller, which you couldn't do in flight. And so if it stopped completely, the only thing you could do was glide to a landing. Accidents were commonplace. Next slide. This is the sort of aeroplane that Dunning moved on to. Once he qualified to fly at the end of October 1914, he went to the Naval Air Station at Colshot in Southampton Water, and he would have flown aircraft like this. It's a Sopwith type 807, and it's, as you can see, it's Naval Aeroplane number 807 itself. The pilot sat in the cockpit in the middle. The observer, if he flew with one, sat in the cockpit at the front. It has folding wings so that it can be tucked away into the hangar of an aircraft carrier, and it's got floats. It's designed to take off from and land on the water. So that it could be dragged out onto a beach for maintenance or moved around in the hangar, you can see there are wheels attached to the floats. The problem is, as you can see, there's no suspension on the floats, so you had quite a jarring sensation through the airframe as the aircraft bashed into waves as it maneuvered, and they tended to break with monotonous regularity. Once trained as a seaplane pilot in early 1915, Dunning went out to the Eastern Mediterranean in the first seaplane carrier, HMS Ark Royal, and he took part in the Dardanelles campaign. Next slide, please. This is Ark Royal, the first ship in the world to be built as an aircraft carrying vessel. It's based on a mercantile design. It was built in Blythe, but you can see the bridge and the machinery with the funnel over them have been moved to the after end. Forward of that is a hatch which led down into a hangar under the upper deck. There were 2 steam cranes. Aircraft were lifted out of the hangar and lowered into it, dangling from the crane. The area forward, that's to the right as you look at it, of the 2 cranes, was originally intended for lighter seaplanes to take off using the wheels on their floats, but the ship just wasn't fast enough to generate enough wind to allow them to get airborne, so it was almost never used. You can see aircraft on deck being prepared for flight. Because the propeller had to be swung by a mechanic, the engine would be started on that deck. The steam crane would lift it up, lower it into the water. It would fly its sortie from the sea. In the Dardanelles, that would have been reconnaissance, looking for the enemy, or spotting the fall of shot of battleships bombarding Turkish forts. The steam cranes weren't designed for the ship. They were taken out of a dockyard. They're powered by coal. They were quite efficient for their day, but rather messy, as you can imagine, with cinders having to be raked out of the boilers every few minutes. Next slide, please. This is a view from Ark Royal's bridge. She's anchored in Mudros Harbour in one of the Aegean islands. You can see down at the bottom of the picture, looking into the hangar, there's a man walking in it. You can see past the steam cranes to the deck, and the nearest aircraft is short Type C seaplane number 162, and its sister 163 is beyond it. It's attached, 162 is attached to one of the cranes. You can see mechanics are working on it. Some of the engine cowlings are off, and there are ladders up against it. 2 sorts of mechanics. Fitters worked on the engine. Riggers worked on the airframe itself, made of different sorts of wood with canvas doped covering. On 162, you can see the early Royal Navy markings, a Union flag on the fuselage side, and circles on the top wing, red on the outside, white on the inside. So when this picture was taken in 1915, we hadn't standardized on the later red, white and blue national roundels. Next slide, please. This is the aeroplane that carried out the first reconnaissance mission over the Gallipoli Peninsula. All the aircraft in the Gallipoli campaign were Royal Navy aircraft. It's a poor picture, but it shows aircraft number 136. Again, it's a short seaplane. It had the most powerful engine in the world in 1915, a 200 horsepower Canton Une, but even with that, it took a long time to get airborne, and the floats were particularly vulnerable if you had a choppy sea. It came to grief on a number of occasions when the floats collapsed or it was damaged by enemy small arms fire, because even with that powerful engine, it couldn't climb very high over the Gallipoli Peninsula. Next slide, please. Dunning flew it on a number of occasions, and on a number of occasions the floats collapsed underneath him, but the aircraft being light and made of wood, it tended to float, and that could well be Dunning, the pilot, you can see by the engine, grabbing a rope thrown by one of Ark Royal's boats to recover it. It was rebuilt several times, but both the senior aviator on board the ship, Squadron Commander H.A. Williamson, and Dunning had rapidly came to the conclusion that seaplanes weren't the answer. They were just too fragile, they took too long to get airborne, and the weight of the floats were quite a penalty with the low-powered engines of the day. Next slide, please. So after the initial Gallipoli campaign, Dunning stayed in the Aegean Islands with the Royal Naval Air Service, and he flew this sort of aeroplane. It's a Newport 2-seater Scout. That was the 1916 word for a fighter. He flew with an observer who had a machine gun mounted on a pintle, and he had a forward-firing Lewis gun. By now you can see the roundels have grown into the ones we recognize today, blue outer, white, and then a red inner circle. Next slide, please. This is a rather better picture of a Newport. It's still a two-seater, but you can see the pilot in the front cockpit, but the observer's cockpit's been plated over. If he didn't carry an observer, it was lighter, and that gave him a little bit more performance. You can see this aircraft's operating as a fighter. If you look at the middle of the top wing, you can just see the barrel of a Lewis gun poking out. It was flying one of these, but with an observer, Sub-Lieutenant Oxley, that Dunning attacked Turkish positions in Port Lagos in June 1916. You can see this aircraft is about to take off. No brakes, so chocks are keeping it in place, and you can see mechanics holding pieces of string attached to the chocks so that they can be pulled away quickly when he's ready to go. They would then grab the wingtips to help him turn into wind, and off he'd go. In the attack on Port Lagos, the Royal Navy aircraft were attacked by Turkish fighters, and Dunning took a bullet through his leg as they neared the target. It started bleeding badly, and so he had to get his observer, Oxley, to lean forward and steady the aircraft by holding the controls, while Dunning tied a belt round his leg as a tourniquet to staunch the flow of blood. He went on with the attack, dropped his bombs, got back to Mudros okay, and for this he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was, however, invalided back to the UK. Next slide, please. Where he was appointed to the Admiralty and the Naval Air Department, and for duties at both an office in London and at the Naval Air Stations at East Church, where he'd been trained 2 years earlier, and at the Experimental Air Station at Isle of Grain, also in the Isle of Sheppey. His duties were to look into better ways of operating high-performance fighters from ships at sea. And this is a high-performance fighter from the era. It's a 1915 picture of a Bristol Scout, number 1258. This aircraft operated in East Church's war flight, as well as training, as well as research and so forth. Each church maintained operational fighters that could be used against Zeppelins attacking the UK. So he would have flown this aircraft. He would also have flown in Sopwith Pups at Isle of Grain, which looked at ways in which you could land an aircraft on a flat deck on a ship and stop its motion. Next slide, please. The Navy came up with a lot of theories about ways and means that aircraft could be operated safely from a ship. And one of the things you have to bear in mind is that the aircraft of the time had very light wing loadings. In other words, they were like a kite. If it was stood on the ground and a strong gust of wind caught it, that gust of wind would lift the whole aircraft up, then drop it and break it. So one of the problems if you did land on a ship was you had to make pretty sure that a handling party grabbed it and held it until it could be lashed firmly to the deck. Otherwise, it could just be blown over the side like a kite. Also, it was quite difficult to take off unless the ship was accurately into wind. And one of the ideas was to put roller skates like these underneath the wings of a Sopwith Pup fighter. They interfaced with planks, which was thought at the time could be built over the forecastle of a cruiser. Next slide, please. Same aeroplane, rather better view. You can see the two planks laid out here. You can just about make out the rollers under the wings aligned with them, and you can see that the Pup's wheels are off the ground. No brakes on the roller skates, just like the aircraft wheels. So its engine is running at full power, no throttle like the earlier aircraft, but he's being held back by mechanics. Looking back at photographs like this, it's interesting to see that they've all got their hats on, despite the fact there's a whirling propeller blowing quite a lot of slipstream back past the fuselage over them. Next slide, please. Another of the bright ideas was to build a dummy ship flight deck at the Isle of Grain, and you can see that at the bottom right of the picture. It was made of wood. It cost £800 to construct. It was circular, so that aircraft could land onto it into wind wherever the wind was blowing. And they came up with the idea of putting arrestor wires across the deck to be caught by a hook lowered from the aircraft. This is Sopwith Pup M9497. It's one of a batch that were built and then issued to the Isle of Grain for deck landing trials. And you can just make out the hook. It's in the lowered position against a tree underneath the N of N497. That's it. So he's just coming in over the deck, the pilot. Could even be Dunning flying it. He flew this aircraft on a number of occasions onto the dummy deck at the Isle of Grain. Next slide, please. Grainy picture, I'm afraid, but the hook shows up better, and you can see he's just coming in over the wooden deck. You can see between the wheels, there's a horn stuck forward. That's to protect the propeller from the arrestor wires, which are held up slightly proud above the wooden deck. Next slide, please. Again, a rather grainy picture, but you can see now the hook has grabbed the first arrestor wire. At the bottom of the picture, by the right-hand white wooden upright, you can see the sandbag at the end of the arrestor wire. Unlike arrestor wires on modern British, American, Chinese or Indian aircraft carriers, they weren't attached to drums under the flight deck. These wires were attached to 30-pound sandbags at either end of the wire. And again, you can see the hook's quite large. The idea wasn't that you just picked up one wire which stopped you. You picked up one, then a second, then a third. And the gradually increasing weight of sandbags and rope gave you gradual retardation until the aircraft was stopped. It also meant that the aircraft was quite firmly anchored on the deck. But for some reason, the Royal Naval Air Service wasn't too impressed with this as an idea, and instead they eventually went for a system of fore and aft retaining wires, which engaged in small hooks on the aircraft axle. That did actually keep the aircraft anchored when it was down, but it proved very difficult to move the aircraft. It proved very difficult to walk across it, and so the idea wasn't kept going for very long into the 1920s. The American Navy, on the other hand, were impressed by the idea of the deck hook you see here, and they proceeded with it after the war. And of course, from the 1920s on, the Royal Navy and everybody else used this technique as well for stopping aircraft. Next slide, please. Right, we're getting towards Dunning's landing. At the moment, we left him at the Admiralty, where he was in the Air Department looking at better ways of landing. While he was doing so, the Grand Fleet Aircraft Committee was looking at ways of getting fighters to the fleet which could shoot down Zeppelins carrying out reconnaissance missions for the Germans, finding out where our fleet was. They came up with the idea of taking the large, light battle cruiser Furious, which was being built on the time, and instead of fitting the forward gun turret, fitting a large flying off deck, very much big enough for aircraft like this to take off. She was due to complete in mid-1917, and so a batch of 5 Sopwith Pups were built for her by the Beardmore Shipbuilding Company on the Clyde. This is one of them, ensign 6453, and it was to become famous. If you look at the cockpit, you can see there's a Lewis gun on a tripod mounting pointing slightly upwards. It's upwards because they wanted it to fire clear of the propeller arc. Different versions of the Pup on the Western Front had a Vickers gun which fired from in front of the cockpit through the propeller arc using an interrupter mechanism to make sure it didn't go bang when there was a propeller in the wrong place. But that slowed the rate of fire. The Navy also used specialized ammunition to attack Zeppelins. They used, in the drum, which you can see on the top of the Lewis gun, held 47 rounds, and they were loaded in the order of ball for knocking a lead bullet for knocking holes in the Zeppelin, tracer, so that the pilot could see where his bullets were going and adjust his aim, Brock, which was an explosive round built by the Brock Firework Company, and Pomeroy. Brock was an incendiary round. Pomeroy was an explosive round designed by a New Zealander called Pomeroy. Other than that, it's a fairly standard Pup, wheeled undercarriage, no brakes, tail skid. Next slide, please. And this is N6453 itself. It's at the Naval Air Station at Smoogrow. I would say it's just landed because the pilot's in it and the mechanics are probably coming out to wheel it in with the photographer who took this picture. You can see the propellers stopped. If it was about to start, they would be surrounding the engine. As you can see, the field at Smugru is pretty much the same today as it was in 1917 in July when this aircraft arrived. Next slide, please. This is N6452, the other aircraft flown by Dunning. It's in fact the one that he carried out his third fatal attempt to land in on the 7th of August 1917. It's in colour, so you can see the green upper surface and the doped linen sort of colour of the undersurfaces. You can see that it's got leather grab handles attached to it, and that's quite a good way of telling photographs from the various landings, telling which ones they are. I mentioned earlier that aeroplanes were very susceptible to being blown off the deck by the wind, so it was important that people grabbed them as soon as the wheels touched the deck. In the first landing, there were no handles, and they found it difficult to find things to take firm hold of. So for the second landing, all the aircraft were fitted by their riggers with these leather grab handles sewn onto strong points. Next slide, please. This is the Pup's engine. It's an 80 horsepower Lerone rotary engine. You can't see the fixed crankshaft, but everything you see here would rotate as a mass around that fixed crankshaft. The bit you can see in the middle with the 8 bolts in it is where the propeller was fitted on. You can see the fins would cool the cylinders as it was rotating. Oil would be fed out from the center, would make its way up through the cylinders, and then would be lost in a total spray from the engine. As you can imagine, with the mass of this rotary engine whirling, there was quite a torque reaction with it and its propeller. And it was actually quicker in a Pup and its replacement, the Sopwith Camel, to turn 270 degrees to the left with the torque than it was to attempt to turn 90 degrees to the right against the torque. Since so many pilots in the First World War flew Pups, triplanes and Camels, and other aircraft with similar rotary engines, that's why pilots got into the habit of flying left-hand circuits rather than right-hand circuits against the torque. And to this day, all military airfields fly left-hand circuits. Dunning flew a left-handed pattern when he came out to Furious. Next slide, please. This is the inside of a Pup cockpit. You can see big brass clockwork dials that give you engine rotational speed, height, and aircraft speed. You can see the sliders behind the rudder bars on which the pilot rested his feet. You can see the control column displaced to the left, and if you look at the crossbar at the top of it, you can see a switch with a wire running from it. That's the blip switch, that's it, which the pilot would use that would turn the magneto on and off. No throttle control, although he did have a mixture control with which he could adjust the amount of fuel going in depending on the height he was flying at. So the pilot, if he was diving or coming in to land, would blip the engine on and off to slow the aircraft down. And it was conveniently on the control column where he could rest his thumb on it. Next slide, please. And this is the ship that made it all possible. The Grand Fleet Aircraft Committee decided they needed to get fighters to sea quickly in 1917, and this is the result. She was designed as a light battle cruiser with a gun turret at front and back. You can see the one at the rear, which was fitted. It has an 18-inch gun, the biggest gun ever fitted to a British warship. You can see the size of it by comparing the barrel with the men stood underneath it. The one forward was never ever fitted. Instead, they plated over the barbette and built the box you can see, that's a hangar, with an extension from the hangar roof going forward and sloping slightly down. You can see the latticework structure to form a flight deck 228 feet long, 57 feet wide at its widest point aft, and 36 feet wide forward. Compare that with the wingspan of a Sopwith Pup, which was 26 feet 6 inches, and you can see the deck was plenty big enough for it. Like Ark Royal, there was a hatch at the after end of the hangar through which aircraft were raised and lowered by the two derricks you can see in their stowed position. Aft of them on the centre line, there's an armoured conning tower, the bridge, the funnel, and then a mainmast right aft. On deck, indicated by my learned friend, you can see two Sopwith Pups. Thank you, spot on. That gives you an idea of scale. You can see the scale of Dunning's aircraft with the scale of the deck he landed on. You can see there are sort of planks that have been raised vertically around the aircraft. They're called Yorkshire brakes. Each one of those is a bulk of timber fitted through U-shaped metal objects on the side of the hangar. They could be slid up and locked in position in order to provide a windbreak and keep the aircraft safe from gusts which might otherwise blow them over the side. So you can see it's been partially deployed. She's anchored here in Orphea Bay, and you can see in the bottom right there's a boat being towed ashore by the boat in which the photographer is going ashore. As soon as Dunning joined her in early July, he realized that this deck was not only big enough to launch a pup, it was big enough for one to land on too, if he flew very carefully, past the bridge and the funnel, past the derricks, and then slid over the deck. An aircraft stalls, in other words, stops flying and drops, when its wing decelerates, slows down below flying speed. For a pup, that would be about 45 knots. So if the aircraft's flying faster than 45 knots, the wing gives lift and it stays airborne. Slow below that, and it would drop until it picked up speed again. Dunning realized that here he had his chance. This was a ship that could steam at 32 knots in a part of the world, as you know better than I, is known for its reasonably prevalent wind. So he worked out that if the ship steamed at 25 knots into a 20-knot wind, he could actually hover the pup just above its stalling speed alongside the deck, and then by using his ailerons and rudder, he could slide the aircraft sideways over the deck, blipping the engine on and off to maintain his speed. He could then blip it off once he was over the middle of the deck and come down and land to be grabbed by a handling party. So this was the ship that made it possible. Dunning had joined as a senior flight officer. She had a flight of 5 pups and 6 short 184 biplane seaplanes, which could be launched from this deck on wheeled trolleys that ran along a slot down the middle of the deck. They couldn't land on, and they would have to land in the water. As intended, the pups couldn't land on either, and so they'd have to ditch alongside the ship. The aircraft would be written off if they were out of range of an airfield ashore. So effectively, they were one-shot systems like a modern missile. So obviously, there was a huge advantage to be gained if Dunning could find a way of landing his fighters back on board the ship, because they could be used multiple times. Next slide, please. And here we have it. This is Dunning's first attempt to land on. It's 11 o'clock on the 2nd of August 1917. He's in Sopwith Pup N6453. He's flown out to the ship, which was carrying out a gunnery ranging exercise to the west of Swona Island, to the south of Scapa Flow. Soon as that was finished, the captain, Captain Nicholson, called him in. When the ship was anchored in Orphea Bay, Dunning had practiced the manoeuvre while she was lying into wind. He'd flown over the deck, tried hovering, touched his wheels and flown off again. The captain had watched him do it, and he was so impressed that he gave Dunning permission to carry out the landing for real. And they took some senior officers from the Grand Fleet at sea to see him do it. You can tell this is the first landing. Unfortunately, the photograph isn't the best quality. You can see it's quite dark, but you can see and identify the aircraft because if you look at the lower wing, the right-hand tip of the lower elevator there has been damaged, and there's a triangle of white paint on it. You can also see, looking at it, that there are no leather grab handles on it. So the handling party have got to grab hold of whichever bits they can get hold of. There's no machine gun on the mounting forward of the cockpit, and he hasn't got a full load of petrol, so the aircraft's quite light. Dunning had worked out that to put himself in the best position, bearing in mind that he had to fly along the left side of the ship, get clear of the derricks and the bridge and the armoured conning tower, he had a white line painted on the deck, which you can see stretching across it, the eye line. So he knew once his eye was levelled with this and he got into a hover, that all he had to do was move right until he was abreast you can see the raised bit down the center of the deck along which the seaplane trolley moved. And you can see here he's still moving. The lower right aileron is up. So in other words, he's dipping the right wing. His rudder is deflected to the right, so he's sliding slowly across to the right. And as soon as he's well and truly over the deck, he's going to blip the engine off, come down, handling party have got him, done it. He can prove that it is perfectly practical to land a high-performance fighter on a ship at sea. Next slide, please. And this is a minute later. Bay. I'd like to know that you're sailing over a historical piece of history. If you look to the left, just below the upper wing, you can see the island of Flotta. In the previous slide, you could also just make out the tiny island of Switha, just south of Flotta. So there's Dunning. He's done it. He's climbing out of the cockpit. His fitters and riggers are gathering round to hold the aircraft down. The other pilots are there. And this is the big event. This is what he wanted to prove, that it's perfectly possible to land on board. You can see that as he came down, he's drifted slightly forward of the eye line, but no matter, he's still in the large part of the deck, just at the forward end of the hangar. Next slide, please. He wanted to give it another go, just to prove that it wasn't a one-off event and that it could be regularly repeated. And so this is 5 days later, on the 7th of August. The ship sailed specifically for flying trials this time, and she's raised anchor in Orphea Bay, and she's operating to in between mainland off Houghton, off Smugru, and Flotta. She's heading north towards mainland into the prevailing wind. He carried out one further landing in N6453, but a gust caught the aircraft just as it landed, and it blew backwards into the hatch coaming and damaged the elevators. So he climbed out, walked over to his number 2, who had been going to take off next in N6452, and said, okay, Flight Lieutenant Moore, I want another go myself, climb out and I'll give it a go. He did. This time it was much gustier. He came in blipping the engine, but didn't get a very stable approach and continued to drift forward as he came down. You can see now he's forward of the eye line, and in fact, he's so far forward you can't even see it. And a gust of wind has caught under the port wing. You can see the starboard ailerons are deflected down. He's trying to lift the starboard wing. The rudder is fully deflected left. He's trying to move left. But as he blipped the engine for full power to go round again, the engine choked, too much fuel going into it, and stopped. With no control and being blown from the left, no engine, he couldn't control the aircraft, and it was blown over the side into the sea. There was no crash boat available, and it took 20 minutes for the ship to come back to him. Unfortunately, he hit his head as she went in and he was drowned. Next slide, please. There's no memorial to him other than this one by the edge of Smugru, which I went to in 2017 with John Leith. And as you can see, the lettering on that is pretty badly faded. But I'd like to end up just by reading you a letter, 2 letters in fact, one of which was written to his father from the captain of HMS Furious. And I think that gives you an idea of together they'll give you an idea of the sense of what had happened. His captain said, "I shall never cease to admire him. He was so keen and full of enthusiasm and such an excellent, capable fellow in every way. Both officers and men serving under him deeply feel the loss of so fine an officer and gentleman. The Secretary to the Admiralty wrote to his father, and in a letter which has been preserved in St. Lawrence Church near Bradfield in Essex, where Dunning was buried next to his mother's grave, the Admiralty letter says, "The Admiralty wish you to know what great service he performed. It was in fact a demonstration of landing an aeroplane on the deck of a man-of-war while the latter was underway. This had never been done before, and the data obtained was of the utmost value. It will make aeroplanes indispensable to the fleet and possibly revolutionize naval warfare. The risk taken by Squadron Commander Dunning needed much courage. He had already made 2 successful landings, but expressed a wish to land again himself before other pilots did so, and in this last run he was killed. My Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty desire to place on record their sense of loss to the naval service of this gallant officer. His achievement was a great one. Every landing by every naval pilot in the world, including me, owes a great deal to him, and I think it's pretty important that we remember him. So thank you for listening to me. I hope you've found something new in what I've said, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much. Bye.
Well, David, that's absolutely a captivating talk about the aircraft of the day and this brave pilot and pioneer. He'd probably be called a test pilot nowadays. He's a true hero of the time, more than 100 years ago. We've got a few questions that have come in through the YouTube live chat, and I'd like to start off with one. You mentioned the rank of Squadron Commander, and Squadron Leader's more one that I'm familiar with, David. What's the difference?
Right, the Royal Naval Air Service introduced its own rank structure within the naval service in order to indicate flying proficiency. So they had flight sub-lieutenant, flight lieutenant, flight commander, then squadron commander, who was a slightly more senior gentleman, wing captain, and then admiral, and so forth. And you alternated between them. If you were a career officer, as he was, you had your flying rank, squadron commander, while you were in an RNAS flying appointment, but you would revert to your career long-term rank, lieutenant commander, commander, or what have you, if you were in a general service job. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, thanks for that.
The RAF, when it was created, subsequently copied some of the naval ranks.
Okay.
Get that in.
I've got a couple of technical questions for you. What sort of timber was used in early plane construction, you know, in the struts and props? And
it depended on the different qualities of different woods. Some are stronger along a line, some are stronger in bending moment, etc. Spruce, pine, teak, all of those were used, and many others. Canadian yew, maple, not the heavier ones, because like oak, because they were too heavy, but a lot of them depending on it. If you read my book, The Royal Navy's Air Service, I've got a description of all the woods and how they were used.
Okay. There's another question. Do any planes from this period remain airworthy, or is it just too dangerous?
It's a friend of mine flew a Sopwith Pup and a Sopwith Camel, and he had flown Hunters, Gannets, Phantoms even, and he said they scared the juice out of him by not having a throttle. There are some that are airworthy, and they're operated by the Shuttleworth Trust. So there are 1 or 2. I think they've got a Sopwith Pup. They're not the easiest things to fly if you're a modern pilot, but if you were a pilot of the period, they were everyday thing. Yes, there are 1 or 2, but not many. There are replicas flying in New Zealand.
Yeah. You went into quite a detail about, you know, how the thought processes and process of how Dunning, you know, had to land that plane on the flight deck. Going back to the other end, how long did the flight deck need to be for a Sopwith Pup to take off?
Depends. If the ship was doing 25 knots into a 29 knot wind, A, you would have to hold it on deck, and B, it would go straight up, take off like a helicopter. Right. If there was no wind at all, it would be airborne well airborne within 100 feet.
Okay, I've got time for a couple of more short questions here. What benefits arose from having the top set of wings on a biplane slightly in front of the lower set?
Visibility for the pilot.
So
And I can throw in there, you know, the image of the First World War pilot with the white silk scarf flowing in the breeze. Once air combat evolved from 1916 onwards, while you were airborne, you were vulnerable to another pilot sneaking up where you couldn't see behind and below was the worst thing. So constantly while you're airborne, your head was all over the place looking for other aircraft and then turning to combat them. That was why they wore the silk scarf, because otherwise you chaffed your neck on your tunic. And the staggered wing gave pilots a better view upwards for enemy aircraft.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question of you, David. In some of the early slides you showed, and you also mentioned some of the floats were they were dodgy to say the least, you know, and they were easily damaged in landing or with bad, you know, heavier seas. Did float design advance quickly during World War I?
It advanced actually quickly before it. The first man to take off, the first British pilot to take off from the water was Squadron Commander Schwann, who was standing by the airship R1 in Barrow-in-Furness. He wasn't the first person to land because he hadn't actually yet qualified as a pilot and he crashed. But he made the discovery that if you have a flat float, it tends to stick to the surface of the water unless you have little waves to break it free. He made the discovery that if you have a V-shaped float with a step in it where the float has a notch halfway along, it will slowly rise out of the water and decrease the waterplane area as the wings begin to lift. And that does away with the suction. And having the step means you get air bubbles under the after part of the float as you get bigger. So yes, another Naval Air Service guy, Wing Captain Port, who commanded the air station at Felixstowe, did a lot of work on float design and flying boat hull design. So it did develop enormously.
Cool. David, can I just say thank you so much for giving us your time, your knowledge, your experience, and the passion for this subject, which shines through in spades.
Well, thank you. I've loved doing it. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome. And can I thank everyone in the audience for participating? Can I also say thank you to our technical team behind the scenes who work their magic to bring these festival events to you. The next Aviation Festival talk is about celebrating 55 years of the Britain-Norman Islander. It starts shortly at 3:30 p.m. this afternoon, and a link is hopefully being added to the YouTube live chat as I speak. If you've enjoyed the festival, please do like the Orkney Aviation on their Facebook page, and you can also view and share this year's events as many times as you wish on the YouTube channel. Thank you all for watching. Good afternoon and goodbye for now.
Right. So you've just shut it.